Hello and welcome to an omnivorous review by an omnivorous reader. Now, if you come here through clicking the link or checking the thumbnail, you probably think you know what book this review is about. But I want you to forget that thumbnail and pretend maybe I was tricking you. And tell me if you recognize this book by the description. So, I read it in a Modern Penguin Classics book. The author is a classical English author. The book was first published well over 100 years ago, and the story starts in England with two sisters. The older is more sensible, and the younger is more sensible but not pretty. A damning description back in the day when women could only really subsist themselves on private incomes or by marriage, and possibly slightly less damning today, I'm not sure about that. The younger sister is full of vibrancy and passion and susceptibility. She feels emotions about music that are well described early on in the book when they attend a Beethoven concert. Poetry and everything is huge to her. And the book starts when the younger, more sensibility-oriented sister falls in love with a potentially inappropriate man. So, what book am I describing? Everything I just said is completely true and completely and accurately describes Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. However, it also describes the actual book I read, the one that was on the thumbnail, Howard's End by E M Forster. Great little book, by the way. This is indeed a classic penguin, though it's a classic penguin that's already lived a classic life. Really happy with this book. The cover drawing is by David Gentleman, a name I found very funny, but I really love that black and white drawing, by the way. Okay, so here we've got this book. And it's a tale of two sisters, just like Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility was a fair bit earlier in English history. It is a beautiful book. And so just like Sense and Sensibility, we've got this tale, basically, the lives of these two sisters as they go through life and as marriage approaches. But in Forster's book, the actual focus on love and marriage is reduced compared to Austen. Austen revolved her book entirely around these two sisters and their personal concerns. Forster is far more diverse in his side characters as well as his plot. There's a lot to it that only peripherally uses the two sisters. Now, both of these authors went for third-person descriptions with a little of omniscience there, but not too much. And it was hard not to compare, especially in the early part of the book, with Jane Austen. Now, about so far in, I stopped comparing with Jane Austen, and I swear I don't normally do this. I don't normally come to a new book or a new author and go around comparing them with other authors or similar books. It isn't something I normally do. But fairly early on, I couldn't help going, wow, that's everything I love about Scott Fitzgerald's in, say, Tender is the Night. Fitzgerald's descriptions are overwhelmingly beautiful, in my opinion, and which is why I love his writing. And as you can see, I have loved the writing of this book for a long time, and so has my bird, who likes to help me read sometimes. Early on in Forster's End, the thing I think that first made me think of Fitzgerald in terms of the writing is a point where the older sister, Margaret, is going shopping with someone for Christmas shopping, and it describes the air as being white, and when they alighted from the carriage, tasting like a cold penny. It's like, whoa, that's writing for you. So yes, Forster's book about these two sisters, or as having the two sisters as the primary carriers for the story, is different, obviously, to Austen's. It's much later in history, much closer to ours. There's already motor cars, for example. But I think in places you can definitely tell that the overarching viewpoint is male writing two female characters rather than female writing two female characters. And that isn't a criticism. For some people it probably would be. But I think because it's a third person description of these two characters, it's completely valid. I don't share the opinion some people have that female characters should only be written by females, that First Nations people should only be written by First Nations authors. I don't get that. So the fact that you've got this male character writing two sisters as the main protagonist in this novel works for me perfectly well. But you can at times see the perspective of a man writing women there, and that's really quite interesting, because the things about Margaret and Helen's life that he doesn't write are almost as insightful as the things that he does write, and this is a phenomenally insightful book from start to finish. The other thing I meant to say about 5 minutes ago was, having just read this book, I feel like I probably have read E M Forster before, but I don't remember it, and I've definitely never read this book before. I also haven't researched it. So I may be about to make a huge embarrassing fool of myself, because English literature tends to have a lot of fans, a lot of people who go into it quite deeply, a lot of people who've analysed it, and a lot of people who've read the analyses of the work, and I've done none of that. I haven't even done a Wikipedia search on Howard's End. Everything that I know about this book and this author, for all intents and purposes, is within this volume. So on the back there's a little bit of describing E. Forster, saying that he is not a prolific novelist. He has indeed written only 5 books, yet at least 2 of them, A Passage to India and Howard's End, are widely regarded as masterpieces. It sounds like he was a humble man and didn't consider himself a great author. I've got to disagree. The writing is spectacular. Now, I've ended up with Howard's End essentially because I was looking for Passage to India a couple of years ago and I couldn't find it. When I saw this in the wild, as we say, in a bookshop in, I think it was Gympie, I leapt upon it, and I finally was in just the right mood to read it. Now, as you can tell, I have a certain fondness for classic English literature, but I have to be in the right mood. It's like experimental new wave sci-fi writing. It's like poetry. It's like plays. Plays are my nemesis. All of these types of writing are ones that I can enjoy, but they're not ones that I'm always going to enjoy. I have to be in the right mood to sit down and read these amazing descriptions like white air, the taste of cold pennies, or it was pleasant to drive home next to a sea like carnelian, which was Mediterranean, by the way. That's a specific mindset. You have to sort of just surf the language, and I was fully in the mood for it when I read this. It's not a fast book to read. I enjoyed it over many days, I think over a whole week. I'm hanging on to this book, and I am definitely going to be rereading it again. Like Fitzgerald, it's one of those books that strikes you straight to the feels through the medium of the English language, and I really love that. Now, at a couple of points while reading this book, I kept thinking, how have I never read it before? How is Forster feeling so new to me? And I think that he probably isn't. I think I probably read Forster, 1 or 2 of his books when I was a teenager, when I was a far more plot-driven reader, and I liked thrilling sequences, I liked action, I liked a bit of adrenaline flowing in my books, and adrenaline is not E M Forster's thing. It's beautiful writing and fascinating commentary on humanity. In that way, again, going back to Austen or Fitzgerald, he reminded me of both at different times in the story. So the majority of the book is actually a very gentle narrative of the 2 sisters and their lives and their ongoing association with the house called Howard's End and the family, the Wilcoxes, that are in it. It's an unfolding, gently rolling story with nothing really much happens. It just sort of surfs the life. But at the same time, I ended up being deeply engrossed in all these small happenings and all these side characters that were interesting in their own way. Like Austen, there is a lot of social critique. I don't know if he had quite such a sense of irony and cynicism as Jane Austen, but maybe he did, I'm not sure. Unlike Fitzgerald in the first part of the book, bad things aren't happening, and bad people aren't really bad, they're just got their own stuff happening that is well described. The last part goes a bit more Fitzgerald on you, as some major events happen, and some of them are quite nasty and quite horrible. The resolution, or the ending of the novel, I suppose, is one that I could never have seen coming. Perhaps that's because I haven't read that author before, but the whole thing resolved in this weird way. It was definitely no Deus Ex Machina. It was definitely no happy ending as such. It was a strange ending, and I was really there for it. I loved every second of it. And that is a lost skill. One whole story in one book, and when you reach the back cover, that's the end of the story, and you have enjoyed every part of it, and the ending isn't begging you to go out and buy the next book. We should recover that writing skill, I feel. I had so many thoughts and feelings and so many things I wanted to share on the video while I was reading it, and I didn't make notes, so I've forgotten a lot of them. If you are an audiobook reader, and I know one person at least watching this is definitely an audiobook reader, then I think this would make a marvelous audiobook for when you don't want adrenaline-filled life. This would be a beautiful story. I can see Patrick Stewart reading it, or someone with one of those beautiful rolling voices, because the descriptions are so amazing. When I describe the younger sister, Helen, as having sensibilities, again, early on in the book, there's this part where both the sisters, their aunt, their cousin, are at a concert, and I think there's a medley of different composers there, but one is Beethoven. And the way Forster describes Beethoven is basically an army of goblins rampaging across the earth. He writes this sequence that could be straight out of a Tolkien fantasy novel. And instead of writing about the actual music, he's writing about what Helen feels based on the music. And I've never really seen anyone write about music that way before. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And it set Helen up beautifully as a woman with strong sensibilities who is invested in the arts, not always conventional, and not always following what other people do. Because at the end of that passage, she gets up and drifts out of the concert hall and goes home, because she doesn't want to dilute the beauty of the Goblin March across the earth with the next piece of music that's coming. And that sets up the book for the entry of a character that is very much part of Forster's social critique, if that was what it was doing. To me, it felt like he had a heavy social critique going throughout people who had money and so have more comfortable lives, and people who have none. Because at the time that Helen leaves the concert hall, she picks up an umbrella belonging to a young man, not belonging to her, but to a young man with whom her sister's talking. Margaret's talking with this guy basically about music. And he, it turns out, is a young clerk. He's not yet 21 at that stage. Comes from a less well-off family than the two sisters do. He's working as a clerk. He doesn't make much money. He has to rent rooms they've got a comfortable house. And he's desperately trying to better himself. He's trying to better himself by reading, by going to concerts. He's trying to find that thing, that nebulous thing that makes man more than he is. Now, this character of Ben, something beginning with B, Leonard is his first name. It's bothering me that I can't remember his name. Okay, we'll call him Leonard. They do it sometimes, then they don't always. Leonard's trying to improve himself, and he feels a great deal of envy toward the two sisters, whose name I can't pronounce because it's German and goes SCH, and I'll just offend someone if I try to say that. He feels an element of attraction because he wants what they have, Hope, because he feels that by discourse with them he can get this elevation to a greater stage of intellectual, I suppose we'd call it, knowledge. And hopeless, angry envy, because they have these things that he never will have. And those different emotions surface at different parts of the book in different ways. He too is a character that goes all the way through the narrative, though he pops up every now and then. He has promised to marry a woman of lower intellectual understanding than him, and she also pops up later in the narrative. So they become part of the sisters. He becomes part of the sisters' ongoing story in several occasional but important ways. And he also opens the stage for discussing wealth, socialism, and a whole host of other things, which Forster manages to do without ever sounding preachy about any of it. I'm almost uncertain, or I was uncertain at parts of the book, that he wasn't even really trying to dissect society. Overall, I think he was. But he was doing it in ways so subtle that I didn't always recognize them. I always enjoyed it as a narrative, but at times I'd go, wait, is that a criticism? I think that's a criticism. I'm not sure that's a criticism, but maybe. It's great. I loved it. Start to finish. Later in the book, Margaret ends up marrying an older man who was the husband of the woman who owned Howard's End. And that's a complicated relationship. If you're into classical literature, I'm sure you know all about it. You probably know more of the ins and outs of it than I do. But that marriage, or that two people coming together, is described in a way that's totally unlike the way any woman would write it, and kind of unlike any other English literature book that I've read. It's like they come together without having anything that we would consider romance. They're engaged for a long time. They have a wedding that he doesn't even bother to show us, and then they're married for a couple of years. In all of this, there seems to be no real romance, and there's not really a meeting of minds, because Margaret is socialist, she's intellectual, she's thoughtful, she's all these things, whereas Mr. Wilcox, Henry I think his name is, really isn't. He's conservative, he's closed-minded, he isn't interested in all of these things. And through their union, Forster manages to show us a lot about what level of intellectual freedom a woman might have to give up in order to marriage, what things are expected from a woman by the man she marries. So once they're engaged, affianced to each other, all the things about Margaret that enchanted Mr. Wilcox in her intellectual freedom and her randomness stop enchanting him, and he starts trying to quash them. She, on her part, very consciously, he does that mostly unconsciously because he isn't described as a self-aware or conscious individual. Margaret, on the other hand, is, and she's aware that she's taking these little ways of guiding her man, she's squashing some of her instincts, and she's doing all of this and tells us about it she's doing it without resentment. She's just seeing this as part of this role that she's adopted. To a modern reader, a lot of that comes across as quite horrifying. And I imagine that many feminists have railed against this book over the years. But the interesting thing about it is that while all of this comes from a man born in the 1800s and was first published in the early 1900s, many of these characteristics are ones that you will see in people who are forming a male-female dynamic union even today. And sometimes these characteristics will be seen in people who are forming a non-traditional relationship, but one in which one is dominant and one is not. You see parts of a personality slowly either leaching out completely or changing as they enter into that relationship. The good relationships out there are the ones where two people come together without losing any of themselves, and both together are greater than the sum of their parts. But that is not the relationship that Forster is really describing here. And I'm not sure if he knows he's doing that. So the later part is a slightly rocky reading in that sense, because on one hand, the modern readers is going, Margaret, why are you throwing away all your intellectual freedom and all your beliefs in order to be with someone who's almost the opposite of everything that you believe in. On the other hand, the slow, subtle writing of this change is fascinating. I don't feel that Forster ever really gives us a reason why Margaret married Mr. Wilcox. Mr. Wilcox marrying her makes more sense because she's younger than him, because he's lonely, and because he doesn't think strongly on any real subject that isn't business. Her marrying him is never really explained. In Austen, it's financial necessity very often, or love. Here, she just does it. And you don't really have a strong sense of why. You don't really have a strong sense of them having a relationship, and you don't have a really strong sense of her having a life. In fact, Forster actively describes the things about her previous life which she now no longer has. Yet she doesn't seem unhappy. She seems conscious of the choices she's made, and it ends on a stronger personal development for her maybe than for Mr. Wilcox, but it doesn't feel like he does it purely as a plot development either. It feels like he's making points. It feels like he's making people, making them real. Anyway, have I embarrassed myself? Have you read Forster? Have you studied Forster in, I don't know, school or something? Is everything I said completely wrong? I wouldn't be surprised. But everything that I've said comes from me. Haven't read any reviews, haven't read anything that anyone else has said about it. Really impressed. I now own all 5 of his books, and I want to read them when I'm in the mood for some of the most beautiful literature I have ever encountered. So thank you for watching. Not my typical science fiction review, but I am an omnivorous reader. Have a great day. Read good books. If you haven't read Forster, you're missing a good book, I'm telling you.